The nature of what constitutes a crime in war is varied and extensive. In general, many of them can be boiled down to don't be evil. Shooting at civilians, shooting at medics, shooting at soldiers who have surrendered, stuff like that. But war's a complicated subject, both morally and procedurally, and over the course of history, there have been attempts all around the world to create a kind of code that everyone follows, in an attempt to make war just a little bit less gruesome. These codes regarding war have evolved to cover various subjects, most famously with the Geneva Conventions, resulting in some actions in wartime being designated as beyond the pale. We've done some digging for you, and today we'd like to present to you a few of those actions for your entertainment. Here are 5 surprising things that are actually war crimes. Imagine you're in the army. Brilliant. Well, suddenly you come under attack, bullets and bombs falling all around you. You run into the nearest building to take cover, which happens to be a museum, but in the commotion you drop your weapon. Oh no! Now, unarmed, you start looking around this museum for something to improvise with, and you soon discover an old sword hanging up on the wall, so you pick it up, weigh it in your hands, and decide, this is a good choice, and you take it up as your new weapon. Better than nothing, right? Except, well, stop right there, buddy, because you've just committed a war crime. Hold on. What? How can using an old sword as a weapon, as the purpose it was originally designed for, be a war crime? Well, it's got to do with Protocol 1 of the Geneva Convention. A bit of background. The Geneva Conventions are not one singular treaty, but rather a series of treaties signed over generations. The first one was signed all the way back in 1864, and new editions of the treaties were negotiated, signed, and ratified over the years in 1906, 1929, and most recently in 1949. These are the main treaties signed by most countries on Earth and form the backbone of international law and armed conflicts. But they're not the only treaties. After the Fourth Geneva Convention in 1949, 3 extra documents were later drawn up and ratified called protocols. These aren't new treaties per se, but legally they're just as good, and they're taken just as seriously. They're still signed and ratified by countries party to them. Protocol 1, the document we're interested in, but now, was signed in 1977, and in Article 53 of Protocol 1 there is a passage that reads as follows. It is prohibited, A, to commit any act of hostility directed against the historic monuments, works of art, or places of worship which constitute the cultural or spiritual heritage of peoples, and B, to use such objects in support of the military effort, and C, to make such objects the objects of reprisals. So, the key section in this article is B, to use such objects in support of the military effort. Now, this passage is generally understood to mean that armies shouldn't use historical monuments or museums full of irreplaceable historical artifacts as cover when under fire, which makes plenty of sense. But the way the passage is written, you cannot, in fact, use an old sword from a museum as a weapon in a modern war, because that sword is technically a cultural artifact, and it says right there that using it in support of the military is prohibited. So, samurai, put that sword down and go pick up your far more effective gun. In the film Oh Brother, Where Art Thou?, there is a scene where the character declares, "I hate cows worse than coppers," before unloading the magazine of a Tommy gun into a herd of cows, killing several. But it turns out this little act of animal cruelty was a whole lot more than that. It was, in fact, a war crime. Well, technically it actually wasn't, because it was the 1920s and there was no war in the movie, but, details. Article 54 of Protocol 1 declares that it is prohibited to attack, destroy, remove, or render useless objects indispensable to the survival of the civilian population, such as foodstuffs, agricultural areas for the production of foodstuffs, crops, livestock, etc., for the specific purpose of denying them for their sustenance value or for any other motive. So, all you Skyrim players who attacked that chicken in the first village, just to be funny, congratulations, you're all war criminals in the game. Fortunately, good news, Xbox Live doesn't extradite to the International Criminal Court, so you probably got away with it. Jokes aside, attacking animals as a means of attritional warfare actually has a long history. The most famous example is probably the United States during the Indian Wars of the 1870s and 1880s. During this time, the US Army sanctioned the mass slaughter of buffalo herds, the primary food source for the Great Plains Indian tribes, putting pressure on them to accept being moved into reservations. This was in addition to commercial buffalo hunting, which combined nearly drove the American bison to extinction and resulted in mass hunger among Indian tribes. This was obviously bad, so outlawing the killing of animals to damage food supplies is a welcome rule. So don't kill cows, or you might end up like George Nelson and get sent to the electric chair for it. Biological warfare is outlawed for several good reasons. It's horrific, and it's inhumane, and it's not really controllable, and it can lead to terrible consequences in the future. But read it the right way, and you'll realize that using barbed wire of the kind widely deployed in World War I could perhaps be a war crime if used in a certain way. For this entry, let's talk about a little-known bacteria by the name of Clostridium tetani, which, when it infects a human, causes a condition that you probably do know called tetanus. This is something that you get a shot for when you're young, and it's a good thing too because tetanus is not pleasant. It causes fever, sweating, and headaches, not bad. Oh, and also muscle spasms that could be strong enough to fracture your bones. Thankfully, contracting tetanus is somewhat difficult, and it's basically impossible if you're vaccinated against it, which most people watching this are. Sensible you made a good choice. The easiest way to contract tetanus, well, aside from directly injecting it into your body like a weirdo, is to puncture your skin with a piece of rusty metal. Rusty metal itself isn't anything special to the bacteria, rather, it's just the perfect place for the bacteria to hang out. They're generally located outside, along with the bacteria, and they're sharp enough to cut anyone who accidentally touches one, which allows the bacteria to enter the wound and begin to reproduce, which is, of course, what bacteria want to do. So you don't get tetanus from rust, which means we kind of cheated with this entry, but rust is generally indicative of something being dirty or old and potentially infected with tetanus-causing bacteria, meaning that if you willingly put up dirty barbed wire to protect your trench without sanitizing it first, you're technically engaging in biological warfare, which, yeah, it's a war crime. The lesson here, always wipe down your barbed wire before use. Climate change continues to be a dominant issue of our time, taking up treaties, political debates, and YouTube videos. But as countries make commitments to reducing emissions, some are also making a different kind of commitment, planting more trees. For example, Pakistan's recently ousted Prime Minister Imran Khan promised in 2019 to plant 10 billion trees as part of its efforts, and so far, it's planted 1.5 billion. Planting trees is only one part of the wider effort against climate change, but it is welcome all the same. We recognize the value of trees and the natural environment at large, which is why targeting them during a war is a war crime. Article 55 of Protocol 1 again states that care shall be taken in warfare to protect the natural environment against widespread, long-term, and severe damage. The same article also states attacks against the natural environment by way of reprisals are prohibited. That means if you lose a battle, you can't take out your frustrations on the nearest birch. Sorry, if you do that, you're a war criminal. This particular issue became salient following the end of the Vietnam War. During the conflict, the American armed forces infamously used incendiary and chemical agents in Vietnam to clear large swaths of jungle as a means of denying Viet Cong fighters cover to hide under. This episode prompted Article 55 being added to Protocol 1 since chemical weapons are, a bad thing. But the general nature of the article can be interpreted to mean any deliberate destruction of the environment, whether it's trees, foliage, waterways, or any other natural formations. So even if you could remove mountains, too bad, General. You'd still have to fight in them, because that's nature. Our last entry on this list concerns the treatment of prisoners of war. The humane treatment of soldiers captured in battle by an enemy army is one of the most widely discussed subjects of the Geneva Conventions, to the point where it has its own section. The conduct regarding prisoners of war is everything that one would expect. No torture, no starving, adequate lodgings, things like that. But there's another interesting addition to those requirements. So it is written in Article 13, Paragraph 2 of the Geneva Convention number 4. Quote, likewise, prisoners of war must at all times be protected, particularly against acts of violence or intimidation, and against insults and public curiosity. That's right, folks, insulting a prisoner of war is actually a war crime. This same provision was also included in a slightly modified form in the Third Geneva Conventions in 1929, meaning it even predates World War II, which was probably one of the worst wars in which to be a prisoner of war. So what gives? The origins of this particular passage stem from what constitutes the general welfare of a prisoner of war. Adequate food, shelter, and medical care is obviously an important concern, but if those needs are met, the pressing need of the soldier might instead be the welfare of their friends or relatives. If, say, they desire to correspond with them, the armed forces holding them have on paper a responsibility to provide that opportunity to the prisoner. So by this logic, the mental and emotional well-being of a prisoner of war is just as valid and important as their physical well-being. So very honourable indeed. At the time of the Third Geneva Conventions, when this passage was written, not everyone agreed with it. The German delegation, it was still Weimar Germany, hold your comments, suggested that the passage be replaced with one protecting soldiers from death, wounds, bad treatment, robbery, injuries, and public curiosity, but that was pushed down in favour of the more specific language of being against insults. The general principle behind it was that prisoners should at all times be treated with humanity, because imprisonment by a war enemy is not supposed to be a punishment. So the next time someone makes fun of you for being a snowflake, simply respond that feelings are protected by the Geneva Conventions. So that's 5 surprising crimes that are technically war crimes. If you'd like to know about some brutal punishments from history, we did a video all about that. I'm going to link to it on the screen now. And thank you for watching.